Edward Harper, known to everyone in Chicago as Eddie, stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his office on the 42nd floor of the Willis Tower, gazing out at the city's jagged skyline. At 62, he was a man who had built an empire from nothing, a real estate tycoon whose name was synonymous with luxury condos and restored historic buildings across Illinois. The late September sun glinted off Lake Michigan, casting a golden glow over the loop. But Eddie's mind was elsewhere. His reflection in the glass showed a man weathered by time, gray hair, thinning at the temples, deep lines etched around his eyes, and a weariness that no amount of wealth could erase. His navy suit, tailored to perfection, felt heavy today, as if it carried the weight of the last 2 years without his wife, Clara. She had been his anchor, his partner in every sense, and her death from pancreatic cancer had left him adrift. The office, with its sleek mahogany desk and walls lined with awards, felt like a museum of a life he no longer recognized. He turned away from the window, his polished loafers silent on the plush carpet, and picked up a framed photo of Clara from his desk. Her warm brown eyes and soft smile stared back at him, a reminder of the woman who had turned his dreams into reality. They'd met 37 years ago, when Eddie was just a 25-year-old, hustling to buy his first rundown brownstone in Wicker Park. Clara, a paralegal at a nearby law firm, would stop by his tiny office to chat, her laughter filling the cramped space with life. They married a year later, and together they transformed Harper Properties into a juggernaut, snapping up neglected buildings and breathing new life into Chicago's neighborhoods. Clara handled the finances, negotiated with contractors, and kept Eddie grounded when success threatened to inflate his ego. But their greatest sorrow was their inability to have children. They'd tried for years, fertility clinics, specialists in New York and London, endless tests that drained their hope. Clara would cry in the dark, thinking Eddie didn't hear, but he did, and his own tears fell silently when she slept. "We'll make our own family," she'd said, her voice fierce with determination. "We'll help kids who need it, Eddie. That's our legacy." And they had funding scholarships, donating to youth centers, rebuilding playgrounds in struggling neighborhoods. But it was always from a distance, through checks and foundations, never face to face. When Clara got sick, Eddie threw everything he had at the disease, flying her to the best hospitals in Boston, Houston, even Zurich. Nothing worked. She slipped away in a sterile room at Northwestern Memorial, her hand cold in his, and Eddie's world crumbled. Since then, he'd poured himself into work, not because he cared anymore, but because it was all he knew how to do. The company grew, but Eddie shrank, becoming a shadow of the man who once dreamed of making Chicago a better place. The phone on his desk buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was his assistant, Linda, her voice clipped and professional. "Your brother's here, Mr. Harper. Says it's urgent." Eddie sighed, rubbing his temples. Nathan Harper, his younger brother by 8 years, was a constant thorn in his side. At 54, Nathan had none of Eddie's drive or discipline. Where Eddie saw opportunity in crumbling facades, Nathan saw only dollar signs, squandering his trust fund on bad investments, fast cars, and a string of ex-girlfriends who always seemed to need loans. Eddie had bailed him out countless times, not out of love, but out of duty. Nathan was family, the only family Eddie had left after their parents died in a car accident when Eddie was 26. Their father, a gruff hardware store owner in Evanston, had always favored Eddie, praising his work ethic while scolding Nathan for his laziness. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" he'd say, and Nathan's face would twist with resentment. That resentment had festered over the years, bubbling up in snide comments and petty arguments. 5 years ago, Eddie had given Nathan a job as head of public relations for Harper Properties, hoping it would give him purpose. Instead, Nathan coasted charming clients with his slick smile, but delivering little else. Eddie tolerated it partly because Clara had urged him to keep Nathan close. "He's your brother," she'd said, her voice soft but firm. "Family sticks together, even when it's messy." Now, with Clara gone, Eddie wondered if she'd been wrong. Nathan burst into the office without knocking, his expensive blazer wrinkled and his tie askew. His dark hair was slicked back, but his eyes were bloodshot, and a faint whiff of whiskey clung to him. "Eddie, we've got a problem," he said, clutching a manila folder. "A big one." Eddie leaned back in his leather chair, skeptical. Nathan's problems were usually excuses to dodge responsibility or ask for money. "What is it this time, Nate?" he asked, his voice flat. Nathan paced his polished shoes, scuffing the carpet. "It's a lawsuit. Some guy's claiming we sold him a condo with faulty wiring, says it caused a fire in his unit. He's threatening to go to the Tribune unless we settle fast." Eddie frowned. Harper Properties had a flawless record on building safety. He'd made sure of it. Every project was inspected twice, sometimes 3 times before tenants moved in. "Who's the complainant?" he asked. Nathan hesitated, flipping open the folder and glancing at papers that looked suspiciously blank. "Some investor from Humboldt Park. He's cagey, doesn't want to meet here. Says he's got proof, photos, documents, the works, but he'll only show us at his warehouse." Eddie's gut twisted. A warehouse in 40 years of business, he'd never met a client in a place like that. Meetings happened in boardrooms, law offices, or at worst a coffee shop in Lincoln Park. But Nathan's urgency was convincing, and Eddie was too tired to argue. "Where's this warehouse?" he asked. "Near the creek off Kedzie Avenue," Nathan said, avoiding his brother's eyes. "He wants us there tonight, 8 p.m. Says it's the only place he feels safe." Eddie shook his head. "This smells like a setup, Nate." Nathan's face hardened, a flicker of something anger, maybe fear, crossing his features. "You think I'd drag you into something shady? I'm trying to protect the company, Eddie. Your company. If this guy goes to the press, we're screwed. You want to lose everything you built with Clara?" The mention of Clara stung, and Nathan knew it. Eddie clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the photo frame. "Fine," he said, "but we're bringing security." Nathan waved a hand dismissively. "No need. This guy's paranoid. Extra people will spook him. Just you and me, Eddie, like old times." The words hung in the air, heavy with a history neither wanted to unpack. Eddie nodded, but unease settled in his chest, like a stone. That evening, as the sun dipped below Chicago's skyline, Eddie and Nathan drove to the industrial sprawl of Humboldt Park. The streets grew narrower, lined with chain-link fences and graffiti-covered walls. The air smelled of diesel and decay, and the distant hum of the city faded into an eerie quiet. The warehouse was a hulking relic, its windows boarded up and its brick facade crumbling like an old tooth. Eddie parked his sleek black Mercedes beside a rusted dumpster, his unease growing. "This is it?" he asked, scanning the desolate lot. Nathan nodded already, climbing out of the car. "Yeah," Guy said he'd be inside. Eddie followed his polished shoes, crunching on gravel. The warehouse door creaked open, revealing a cavernous space lit only by a few flickering fluorescent bulbs. Dust motes floated in the air, and the smell of mold was overwhelming. Eddie's instincts screamed at him to leave, but Nathan was already striding ahead, calling out, "Hey, we're here!" No answer came. Then from the shadows 2 figures emerged, big men, their faces obscured by hoodies, their hands gripping metal pipes. Eddie froze, his heart pounding. "Nate, what the hell?" Before he could finish, Nathan turned his face cold and unreadable. "Sorry, Eddie," he said, his voice low. "You're too old. Too stubborn. This is better for everyone. The first blow came fast, a pipe slamming into Eddie's ribs with a sickening crack. He stumbled, gasping, as pain exploded through his body. The second man swung at his head, and Eddie ducked, but not fast enough. The pipe grazed his temple, blood streaming into his eyes. He collapsed to the concrete floor, the world spinning. Through the haze, he saw Nathan watching, his arms crossed, a faint smile on his lips. "You always got everything," Nathan said, his voice dripping with venom. "Dad's praised the money, Clara. Now it's my turn." Eddie tried to speak, to beg, but his throat was thick with blood. The men hit him again and again, ribs, legs, back, each blow a thunderclap of agony. Nathan's voice cut through the pain. "When they find you, I'll play the grieving brother. I'll inherit it all, Eddie. Every damn cent." The last thing Eddie saw was Nathan's silhouette against the flickering light, turning away as the darkness swallowed him. When Eddie came to, he was no longer in the warehouse. Cold water lapped at his legs, and the stench of rot filled his nose. He lay sprawled in a shallow creek, its murky surface slick with oil and debris. His body screamed with pain, ribs broken, head throbbing, blood crusted on his face. The night sky above was starless, clouded by the city's glow, and the distant wail of a siren was the only sound. He tried to move, but his limbs felt like lead, and every breath was a knife in his chest. His suit was torn, his gold watch caked with mud, a cruel reminder of the life he'd lost in an instant. The betrayal burned worse than the wounds. Nathan, his little brother, the boy he'd protected after their parents died, had planned this. Eddie remembered the times he'd covered for Nathan's mistakes, paying off his gambling debts, smoothing over his botched deals, giving him a job he didn't deserve. Clara had warned him. "Nathan's got poison in him," she'd said once, her eyes narrowing as Nathan left their house after another argument. "He loves you, but he hates you more." Eddie hadn't listened. He'd thought family was stronger than envy, that blood meant loyalty. Now, lying in the filth of a Humboldt Park creek, he knew better. His brother had sold him out for the empire Eddie had built, for the millions in bank accounts, the properties scattered across Chicago, the legacy he and Clara had poured their lives into. Eddie's vision blurred, not from blood, but from tears. He thought of Clara, her voice echoing in his mind. "We'll make our own family." He'd failed her, failed himself. As his consciousness faded, he wondered if this was the end, a lonely, broken man discarded like trash. He didn't know that a boy was about to stumble across him, a boy whose kindness would rewrite his story and prove that family isn't just blood, but the bonds we choose to forge. The cold water of the creek gnawed at Edward Harper's legs, each shallow ripple sending a fresh jolt of pain through his battered body. He lay half submerged in the muck, the oily surface of the water reflecting the dim glow of a distant streetlight in Chicago's Humboldt Park. His ribs throbbed with every shallow breath, and the gash on his temple pulsed blood, mixing with the grime caking his face. The night air was thick with the stench of decay, rotting leaves, industrial runoff, and something metallic, like rust or blood. Eddie's mind flickered in and out, caught between the haze of pain and the sharp sting of his brother Nathan's betrayal. He could still see Nathan's cold smirk, hear his voice. "It's my turn." The words cut deeper than the blows from the pipes. Eddie, at 62, had built a real estate empire from nothing, turning crumbling Chicago buildings into gold. He'd given Nathan everything, jobs, money, second chances, only to be left for dead in this filthy creek. His suit, once a symbol of his success, was now a sodden ruin, and his gold watch, a gift from his late wife Clara, was smeared with mud. He tried to move to drag himself out of the water, but his arms buckled and a groan escaped his lips. The world tilted, and he thought, "This is it. This is how I die." Alone, broken, discarded. But then a rustle in the bushes snapped him back. Footsteps, light and cautious, crunched on the gravelly bank. Eddie's heart raced. Had Nathan's thugs come to finish the job? He squinted into the darkness, his vision blurry, and saw a small figure approaching, a silhouette against the faint city glow. It wasn't a thug. It was a boy, no older than 13, his skinny frame dwarfed by a faded bull's hoodie and patched jeans. His sneakers, worn thin at the soles, squeaked on the wet ground. The boy froze when he saw Eddie, his brown eyes wide with shock. "Oh, man," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You alive?" Lucas Carter had walked this creek path 100 times, scavenging for bottles and cans to sell for a few bucks. At 13, he knew the South Side like the back of his hand, every alley, every shortcut, every spot where trouble hid. He lived with his mom, Marissa, in a cramped apartment on 63rd Street, a place where the walls were thin and the heat only worked half the time. Marissa was a nurse's aide, working 16-hour shifts at a nursing home, coming home with sore feet and a smile she forced for Lucas's sake. His dad, Marcus, had split when Lucas was 6, chasing poker games and slot machines until he gambled away everything, including his family. He wasn't bad, Marissa would say, her voice soft with old pain. Just weak. Lucas didn't hate his dad, but he'd promised himself he'd be stronger, that he'd take care of his mom one day. That's why he was out here after school, poking through the weeds for anything he could turn into cash. He'd already found 2 soda cans and a cracked plastic bottle when he spotted something odd, a pile of clothes, or so he thought, until it moved. Lucas's first instinct was to run. The creek was a dumping ground for bad things, stolen bikes, broken furniture, sometimes worse. Kids at school told stories of bodies washing up, victims of gang fights or deals gone wrong. But then he heard a low moan, and his feet stopped. He edged closer, heart pounding, and saw the man bloodied, bruised but breathing. His face was swollen, one eye nearly shut, and his fancy suit looked like it belonged in a downtown office. Not here. Lucas glanced at the man's wrist, where a gold watch glinted under the mud. This guy was rich, no question. Lucas's mind raced. Call the cops. No way. In his neighborhood, police meant trouble questions, suspicions, maybe even blaming him for whatever happened. But he couldn't just leave the guy. His mom had raised him better than that. Help when you can, she'd say, because the world's hard enough. Lucas crouched beside the man, his hands shaking. "Hey, mister, you okay?" The man's eyes fluttered open, cloudy with pain. "Where am I?" he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "The creek near Kedzie," Lucas said. "What happened to you?" The man coughed, wincing. They got me. My brother." His words trailed off, and Lucas saw fear in his eyes, real fear like the kind Lucas saw in kids running from bullies. This guy wasn't just hurt. He was scared for his life. Lucas didn't know what to do, but he knew he couldn't leave him here. The creek was cold, and the man was shivering, his lips turning blue. Lucas looked around. No one else was nearby, just the hum of traffic in the distance. "Can you stand?" he asked. The man tried, but his legs gave out, and he slumped back into the mud. Lucas, small for his age, but wiry from years of carrying heavy bags of recyclables, hooked an arm under the man's shoulder. "Come on, I got you." It was a struggle. The man was heavy, probably twice Lucas's weight, and every step sent pain shooting through his own skinny arms. The man groaned with each movement, his breathing ragged. Lucas half-dragged him up the bank away from the water and onto a patch of dry grass. "My mom's place ain't far," Lucas said more to himself than the man. "We'll get you cleaned up." The walk to the apartment took nearly 20 minutes, with Lucas stopping every few steps to let the man catch his breath. The man mumbled something about not safe, and "they'll find me." But Lucas didn't press. He'd seen enough in his neighborhood to know when someone was running from something bad. By the time they reached the faded brick building on 63rd Street, Lucas was sweating despite the cool September air. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, and the elevator was as usual out of order. Lucas hauled the man up the stairs, his skinny legs burning with the effort. When they finally reached the door, Lucas fumbled with his key, praying his mom wouldn't freak out. Marissa Carter was stirring a pot of spaghetti when the door creaked open. At 34, she looked older than her years, her face lined from long shifts and longer worries. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, but her eyes were sharp, always watching for trouble. When she saw Lucas dragging in a bloodied stranger, she dropped the wooden spoon sauce splattering on the stove. "Lucas? What the hell?" she snapped, rushing over. "Who is this Lucas?" Panting, set the man down on their sagging couch. "Found him by the creek, Ma. He's hurt bad." Marissa's nurse's instincts kicked in, but so did her caution. She'd seen too many scams, too many people using sob stories to get close. The man's suit torn as it was screamed money, and his watch could have paid their rent for a year. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice firm. The man lifted his head, his gray eyes meeting hers. "Eddie," he said, his voice hoarse. "Eddie Harper. I got jumped. Please don't call the cops." Marissa's eyes narrowed. "Why not you in trouble?" Eddie hesitated, then nodded. "My brother, he did this. He'll kill me if he knows I'm alive." Marissa exchanged a look with Lucas. She'd heard stories like this before, family fights, money disputes, things that ended in blood. But something in Eddie's voice, raw and broken, told her he wasn't lying. She grabbed a first aid kit from under the sink, her hands moving with the efficiency of someone who'd patched up plenty of wounds. "Lucas, get me some warm water and a clean towel," she said. As Lucas ran to the kitchen, Marissa knelt beside Eddie, inspecting the gash on his head. "You're lucky you didn't drown in that creek," she muttered, dabbing at the blood. What kind of brother does this? Eddie's laugh was bitter, cut short by a wince, the kind who wants it all. As Marissa cleaned his wounds, Eddie's mind drifted to the warehouse, to Nathan's betrayal. He'd always known Nathan was jealous, but he'd never imagined it would come to this. Growing up in Evanston, Eddie had been the golden child, straight-A student star of the debate team, the one who took over their dad's hardware store when he got sick. Nathan, 8 years younger, was the screw-up, always in trouble, always compared to Eddie. When their parents died, Eddie was 26, Nathan just 18. Eddie had stepped up, paying for Nathan's college, bailing him out of bad deals, even giving him a cushy job at Harper Properties. Clara had warned him. "He's got a chip on his shoulder, Eddie," she'd said one night, watching Nathan leave their Lakeshore Drive penthouse after begging for another loan. "He's not grateful. He's plotting." Eddie had brushed it off, thinking family loyalty would win out. Now, as Marissa bandaged his ribs, he saw how wrong he'd been. Nathan had lured him to that warehouse with a fake lawsuit, knowing Eddie's sense of duty would make him go. The thugs had been waiting, their pipes swinging with purpose. Eddie's wealth, his empire, meant nothing now. He was just a man broken and alone, relying on the kindness of strangers. Lucas watched from the kitchen doorway, clutching a bowl of warm water. He'd never seen anyone so beat up, not even the guys who got jumped outside the corner store. But there was something about Eddie that made Lucas want to help. Maybe it was the way he looked at Marissa, not with pity or arrogance, but with gratitude. Lucas had seen rich people before when he'd gone with his mom to her old cleaning jobs in the North Shore. They'd treated her like furniture barking orders or ignoring her completely. Eddie wasn't like that. "Thanks, kid," Eddie said when Lucas handed him a glass of water, his voice rough but kind. Lucas shrugged, trying to play it cool. "You'd do the same, right?" Eddie's eyes softened, and for a moment Lucas thought he saw tears. "I don't know if I would have," Eddie admitted, "but I'm glad you did." Marissa finished bandaging Eddie's head, her hands steady despite the worry in her eyes. "You need a doctor," she said. "Those ribs might be broken." Eddie shook his head. "No hospitals. They'll find me." Marissa frowned but didn't argue. She'd seen enough in her job to know when someone was running from real danger. "Fine," she said. "You can stay tonight, but we're not a hotel. Tomorrow, we figure out what's next." Lucas piped up, his voice eager. "He can have my bed, Ma. I'll sleep on the floor." Marissa shot him a look, but Lucas's stubbornness won out. She sighed, tossing Eddie a clean towel. "Clean yourself up. You smell like the creek." That night, as Eddie lay on Lucas's narrow bed, a faded Spider-Man blanket pulled over him. He couldn't sleep. Pain kept him awake, but so did the weight of what had happened. Nathan had betrayed him, but this boy and his mother had saved him, no questions asked. The apartment was small, the walls patched with peeling paint, the furniture second-hand and worn. Photos of Lucas as a baby hung on the wall next to a cross stitched with the words, "Home is where love is." It was nothing like Eddie's sprawling Lakeshore Drive penthouse with its marble floors and skyline views. Yet, as he listened to the soft creak of Marissa moving in the next room, checking on Lucas, he felt something he hadn't in years. Warmth. Lucas, curled up on a sleeping bag on the floor, whispered, "You really got a brother who tried to kill you." Eddie nodded, the motion painful. "Yeah, for money." Lucas was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's messed up. My dad left us, but he never hurt nobody. Just disappeared." Eddie's chest tightened. This kid with his patched clothes and holey sneakers had more heart than Nathan ever would. "You're a good kid, Lucas," he said. "Don't ever change." Lucas grinned, his teeth crooked but bright. "I won't. Gotta be a firefighter one day, save people like you." Eddie closed his eyes, the boy's words echoing. A firefighter? Clara would have loved that. As sleep finally pulled him under, Eddie thought of her, and for the first time in 2 years, he didn't feel alone. Edward Harper woke to the smell of burnt toast and the sound of Lucas Carter's laughter filtering through the thin walls of the South Side apartment. His body ached each breath, a reminder of the beating he'd taken in that Humboldt Park warehouse. But the pain was duller now, softened by Marissa Carter's careful bandaging and the unexpected warmth of this small, worn home. At 62, Eddie had spent decades in boardrooms and penthouses, surrounded by polished surfaces and people who wanted something from him. Yet here, in a cramped living room with a sagging couch and a flickering fluorescent light, he felt something he hadn't in years: connection. The past week had been a blur of recovery, with Marissa tending his wounds like a seasoned nurse, and Lucas hovering nearby, his brown eyes wide with curiosity and concern. Eddie lay on Lucas's narrow bed, the Spider-Man blanket tucked around him, and stared at the ceiling, where a water stain spread like a dark cloud. He thought of his brother Nathan, whose betrayal had landed him in that creek, left for dead over a fortune Eddie no longer cared about. Nathan's cold words echoed in his mind. "It's my turn." The memory burned, but so did the kindness of this boy and his mother, who'd taken in a stranger without a second thought. Eddie's ribs still screamed when he moved, and the gash on his temple throbbed under Marissa's neat stitches, but he was alive, and that was because of Lucas. The boy's decision to drag him from the creek to risk trouble for a bloodied man in a suit was something Eddie couldn't wrap his head around. In his world, people didn't help, unless there was a payoff. Yet Lucas, 13 and skinny with sneakers held together by duct tape, had asked for nothing. The apartment door creaked open, and Marissa's voice cut through the morning quiet. "Lucas, you burned the toast again, and I'm making you eat it," she said, her tone a mix of exasperation and affection. Lucas laughed unbothered. "Ma, it's just a little crispy. Eddie'll like it." Eddie smiled, despite himself easing himself upright with a wince. He shuffled to the kitchen where Marissa stood at the stove flipping eggs in a chipped skillet. Her scrubs were clean, but faded, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. Lucas sat at a wobbly table spreading peanut butter on blackened toast with a plastic knife. The kitchen was tiny, barely big enough for the three of them, with a sink full of dishes and a fridge that hummed too loudly. A small vase, made from a tin can, held a few wilted daisies, and a calendar on the wall was marked with Marissa's work shifts. Morning Eddie said, his voice rough. Marissa glanced over her eyes, assessing him like a nurse checking a patient. "You look less like death today," she said, sliding a plate of eggs and toast his way. "Eat. You need it." Lucas grinned, pushing a glass of orange juice toward him. "Ma makes the best eggs. Better than that fancy stuff you probably eat." Eddie took the plate, his hands trembling slightly. He hadn't eaten a home-cooked meal since Clara died. The eggs were simple, a little overcooked, but they tasted like comfort, like something he'd forgotten he needed. "Thanks," he said, meeting Marissa's eyes. She nodded, but her expression stayed guarded. She'd agreed to let him stay a few days, but Eddie knew she was wary. In her world, strangers brought trouble, and a rich guy like him, even beat up and broke, was trouble waiting to happen. As they ate, Lucas peppered Eddie with questions. "You really own buildings, like whole skyscrapers?" Eddie nodded, chewing slowly. "Some, yeah. Mostly condos, offices, a few old theaters I fixed up." Lucas's eyes widened. "Theaters? Like where they show movies. More like plays, musicals. There's one in Logan Square, the Majestic, built in 1910. Clara, my wife, she loved it. We spent a year restoring it." Lucas leaned forward, his toast forgotten. "That's so cool. You ever go inside?" Eddie's throat tightened. "Used to. Not anymore." The boy didn't press, sensing the weight in Eddie's voice. Instead, he launched into a story about a fire that had torn through their old apartment building when he was 8. "I saw the firefighters break down the door, carry Mrs. Lopez out. They were like superheroes. That's why I want to be one, save people like that." Eddie listened, struck by the boy's earnestness. Lucas wasn't just dreaming, he was planning, determined to make a difference despite the odds stacked against him. Marissa, wiping down the counter, chimed in. "He's got the heart for it, but school's tough. Books cost a fortune, and his sneakers." She trailed off, her jaw tight. Lucas shrugged, unbothered. "I'm fine, Ma. I can still run in 'em." Eddie looked at the boy's shoes, the soles flapping like loose lips. He remembered Clara buying shoes for kids through their foundation, always insisting on sturdy ones. "Kids need to run without worrying," she'd say. Eddie made a mental note he'd find a way to help, even if he couldn't stay. That afternoon, while Marissa was at work, Eddie and Lucas sat on the apartment's fire escape, the rusted metal creaking under their weight. The south side sprawled below a mix of crumbling brick buildings and weedy lots, with the distant hum of the Dan Ryan Expressway. Lucas had found an old bicycle frame in the alley, its tires flat and its chain rusted. "Gonna fix it up," he said, poking at it with a screwdriver. "Sell it, maybe get Ma some new scrubs." Eddie watched the boy work his small hands deft despite the lack of proper tools. "You know how to fix bikes?" Eddie asked. Lucas nodded. "Learned from YouTube. Fixed one for my friend Jamal last year." Eddie felt a pang when he was Lucas's age. He was fixing shelves in his dad's hardware store, dreaming of bigger things. "Let me help," he said, surprising himself. They spent the next hour tinkering, Eddie holding the frame steady while Lucas oiled the chain. It was slow work, with Eddie's bruised hands clumsy and his ribs protesting every move. But it felt good, like rebuilding a piece of himself. Lucas chattered about school, his friends, the time he saw a fire truck speed by with its sirens blaring. "You ever been in a fire?" he asked. Eddie shook his head. "No, but I lost a building to one once. Faulty wiring. Nearly bankrupted me." Lucas's eyes lit up. "But you fixed it, right? Built it back." Eddie nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, took everything I had." Lucas grinned. "See, you're tough. Like a firefighter." Eddie laughed, the sound rusty, but real. For the first time in days, he didn't feel like a victim. But the peace was fragile. That evening, Marissa came home with a tense look. "People are talking," she said, setting her bag down hard. "Neighbors saw Lucas bringing you in, asked if we're hiding a fugitive. Said some guys were sniffing around, asking about a rich-looking dude who got jumped." Eddie's stomach dropped. Nathan. His brother must have realized he wasn't dead and sent his thugs to finish the job. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "I didn't mean to bring trouble." Marissa crossed her arms, her eyes sharp. "You didn't mean to, but it's here. Who are these people, Eddie? What do they want?" Eddie hesitated, then told her the truth about Nathan, the ambush, the millions at stake. Marissa listened, her face unreadable. "Your own brother," she said, finally shaking her head. "I thought my ex was bad gambling away our rent. But this—" She didn't finish, but her eyes softened slightly. "You can't stay long. Lucas gets enough crap in this neighborhood without this." Eddie nodded, guilt gnawing at him. He'd already endangered them by staying, but leaving meant going back to a world where Nathan's reach was long, where hospitals and police stations could be watched. He needed a plan, and fast. The next day, while Lucas was at school, Eddie borrowed Marissa's ancient flip phone and called his lawyer, Daniel Weiss, from a payphone outside a corner store. The line crackled, but Daniel's voice was steady. "Eddie, thank God. Nathan's telling everyone you disappeared, that you're probably dead. He's already trying to take over the company." Eddie's jaw clenched. "He tried to kill me, Dan. Hired thugs, dumped me in a creek." Daniel cursed softly. "Where are you safe for now?" Eddie said. "I need you to do something. Set up a trust fund, $5 million for a kid named Lucas Carter, and a monthly pension for his mother, Marissa Carter. Enough so she doesn't have to work herself to death." Daniel was silent for a moment. "You sure about this? That's a lot of money." "I'm sure," Eddie said. "They saved my life, and don't tell anyone where it's coming from." He gave Daniel instructions using an old offshore account Nathan didn't know about. It was risky, but Eddie trusted Daniel. He'd been with him since the early days when Harper Properties was just a dream. Hanging up, Eddie felt lighter, like he'd reclaimed a piece of his purpose. Clara would have approved. She'd always wanted their wealth to mean something, to help people who didn't have a voice. Back at the apartment, Eddie helped Lucas with his math homework, explaining fractions with a patience he didn't know he had. Lucas was quick, soaking up the lessons like a sponge. "You're good at this," Eddie said, ruffling the boy's hair. Lucas grinned. "Better than fixing bikes." "Different," Eddie said. "You've got a brain for numbers. Could be an engineer, maybe even design fire trucks." Lucas's eyes sparkled. "That'd be dope." As they worked, Eddie learned more about Marissa's life. Her ex-husband's gambling debts, the way she'd clawed her way through nursing school while raising Lucas, the constant struggle to keep the lights on. "She works too hard," Lucas said, his voice quiet. "I want to help her, you know, make it so she can rest." Eddie nodded, thinking of Clara, who'd worked just as hard beside him. "You will?" he said. "You're already helping just by being you." But trouble was closing in. That night Lucas came home with a split lip, his bull's hoodie torn. "Some kids at school," he muttered, avoiding Marissa's eyes. "Said we're hiding a drug dealer or something." Marissa's face went pale. "This is because of you," she said to Eddie, her voice low but sharp. "Rumors are spreading. People think we're mixed up in something bad." Eddie's heart sank. Nathan's men must have been asking questions, stirring up suspicion. In a neighborhood like this, rumors were dangerous cops could come knocking, or worse, Nathan's thugs could find him. "I'll go," he said, standing despite the pain in his ribs. "Tonight." Lucas's face fell. "No, you can't. You're still hurt." Marissa put a hand on Lucas's shoulder, her expression torn. "He's right, Lucas. It's not safe for him or us." Eddie looked at the boy, his skinny frame trembling with frustration, and felt a pang of something he hadn't felt since Clara died. Love. Not the fleeting kind, but the deep, fierce kind that made you want to protect someone no matter the cost. "I'll never forget what you did," Eddie said, his voice thick. "You're family to me now." Lucas's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded, wiping his face with his sleeve. Marissa handed Eddie a backpack with some of Lucas's old clothes, jeans, a hoodie, nothing that screamed millionaire. "Stay low," she said, "and don't come back. Not for our sake, but for yours." As Eddie slipped out into the Chicago night, the city's lights felt colder, sharper. He'd leave for Wisconsin at dawn, using cash and a fake ID Daniel had arranged years ago for emergencies. But before he went, he made one last call from the payphone, ensuring the trust fund and pension were secure. Nathan might hunt him, might take his empire, but Eddie would make sure Lucas and Marissa had a future. As he walked away, the weight of his old life lifted, replaced by a new purpose. He'd been given a second chance, not just to live, but to matter. And he'd carry Lucas and Marissa with him wherever he went like a light in the dark. Edward Harper's new life in the small town of Baraboo, Wisconsin, was as far from Chicago's glittering skyline as you could get. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, not diesel and decay. His rented cottage, a squat wooden structure with a sagging porch, sat on the edge of town, surrounded by fields that turned golden in the late September light. At 62, Eddie was no longer the real estate titan who'd reshaped Chicago's neighborhoods. His gray hair was longer now, curling at the collar of the flannel shirts he'd bought at a thrift store, and his hands, once soft from boardroom deals, were calloused from tending a small garden. He'd traded his tailored suits for jeans and a fake name, John Ellis, to avoid Nathan's reach. The pain of his brother's betrayal still lingered, a dull ache, like the bruises that had faded from his ribs, but Baraboo offered something Chicago never had: peace. Eddie spent his days volunteering at the town's community center, teaching math to kids who reminded him of Lucas Carter. Their eager faces, full of dreams despite their small-town lives, kept him going. Every night, though, he thought of Lucas and Marissa, the boy and his mother who'd saved him from that Humboldt Park creek. He wondered if they were safe, if the money he'd left them had changed their lives, if they remembered him. He'd sent a letter through his lawyer, Daniel Weiss, a few weeks after arriving, a short note thanking them and promising to write again. But he kept his distance, knowing Nathan's thugs might still be looking. Eddie's old life, Harper Properties, the penthouse, the millions, was gone, liquidated or tied up in legal battles Nathan was fighting to claim. But Eddie didn't care about the money anymore. Lucas and Marissa had shown him what mattered: kindness, family, the courage to do right by others. As he sat on his porch, watching the stars emerge, he felt Clara's presence, her voice whispering, "This is our legacy, Eddie. People, not buildings." Back in Chicago, Lucas Carter was no longer the skinny 13-year-old who'd dragged Eddie from the creek. At 19, he was taller, broader, his frame filled out from years of working out to prepare for Fire Academy training. His eyes still held that same earnest spark, though the one that had made Eddie trust him that first night. Lucas lived with his mom, Marissa, in a modest but tidy house in Englewood, a step up from their old South Side apartment. The house, bought with the trust fund Eddie had left, had a small garden where Marissa grew tomatoes and a porch where Lucas studied for his fire science exams. The $5 million Eddie had secured for Lucas sat, untouched, in a trust, waiting for him to turn 21, but the monthly pension for Marissa had changed everything. She'd quit her grueling nurse's aide job and enrolled in community college studying to become a registered nurse. "It's for you, Lucas," she'd say, when he protested her long study hours. "And for me. I want to be someone you're proud of." Lucas was already proud, though. Marissa had raised him alone, teaching him to help others even when they had nothing. That lesson had driven him to save Eddie, and it shaped him now as he trained to become a firefighter. At school, he was top of his class, his instructors praising his quick thinking and cool head under pressure. But Lucas carried a secret. The man who'd changed his life, the man he thought of as a father, was out there somewhere, hidden from the world. Eddie's letters came once a year, always on the anniversary of that night, by the creek, postmarked from different towns: Madison, Duluth, La Crosse. They were short, written in Eddie's neat, slanted handwriting, asking about Lucas's studies, Marissa's health, their dreams. Lucas kept them in a shoebox under his bed, reading them when doubt crept in. "You're my family," Eddie had written in the last one. "Keep being the hero I know you are." Meanwhile, Nathan Harper's world was collapsing. 6 months after Eddie's disappearance, Chicago police arrested him in his Lakeshore Drive condo, the one Eddie had bought him years ago. The case had unraveled fast. One of the thugs Nathan hired, a wiry ex-con named Jimmy, flipped under pressure, spilling details of the warehouse ambush to avoid a life sentence. Bank records showed payments from Nathan to known criminals and employees at Harper Properties confirmed he'd fabricated the lawsuit that lured Eddie to Humboldt Park. The media frenzy was relentless. Headlines screamed, "Millionaire's brother plotted murder for fortune," and TV anchors dissected Nathan's fall from grace. In court, Nathan tried to spin a story claiming Eddie had run off with company funds, but no one bought it. The evidence was ironclad: phone records, witness statements, even a grainy security video from a gas station near the warehouse showing Nathan's car the night of the attack. He was convicted of attempted murder and conspiracy, sentenced to 25 years in Stateville Correctional Center. Harper Properties, already teetering from Nathan's mismanagement, was liquidated to pay legal fees and creditors. The empire Eddie had built with Clara was gone, its assets snapped up by competitors. Nathan, once the charming younger brother with a taste for luxury, was now just another inmate, his dreams of wealth reduced to a prison cell. He never knew Eddie was alive, and Eddie, reading about the trial in a Baraboo diner, felt a mix of sorrow and relief. Nathan was his brother, the kid he'd tried to protect, but he'd chosen greed over family. Eddie had no tears left for him. In Chicago, Lucas's life was taking a different path. After graduating from the Fire Academy, he joined the Chicago Fire Department Station 51 in Englewood. His first call was a house fire on 71st Street, where he carried a toddler to safety while his team battled the flames. The mother's tearful gratitude reminded him of why he'd chosen this life: to save people, like he'd saved Eddie. But Lucas wanted to do more. With Marissa's encouragement, he used part of Eddie's pension money to open a community center near the creek where he'd found him. He called it the Harper House, a quiet nod to the man who'd changed everything. The center offered after-school programs, job training, and a safe space for kids like Lucas, had been kids with big dreams and small wallets. Marissa volunteered there, teaching basic nursing skills to teens her own nursing degree, now framed on their living room wall. Lucas poured his heart into the center, spending evenings tutoring kids in math, just as Eddie had tutored him. One night, as he locked up, he walked to the creek, the place where it all began. The water was still murky, the banks littered with trash, but Lucas saw it differently now. It wasn't just a dumping ground, it was where he'd found purpose, where a stranger had become family. He knelt by the water, touching the spot where Eddie had lain, and whispered, "Thanks, Eddie, wherever you are." Years passed, and Eddie's letters kept coming, each one a lifeline for Lucas. They were simple, full of questions about his life, his firefighting, the community center. "I'm proud of you," Eddie wrote in one. "Clara would have loved you." But when Lucas was 25, the letters stopped. He knew without being told that Eddie was gone. The realization hit him one night at the fire station as he sat alone in the bunk room. He pulled out the shoebox, rereading every letter, tears blurring the ink. Eddie had lived long enough to know Lucas had made it, that the boy who'd saved him had become a man who saved others. Lucas grieved, but he also smiled, knowing Eddie had found peace in his quiet Wisconsin life. To honor him, Lucas organized an annual event at Harper House, a kindness day by the creek, where residents shared stories of helping others. Kids planted flowers along the banks, turning the once bleak spot into a place of hope. "It's not about money," Lucas would tell them, echoing Eddie's words. "It's about what you do for people, how you make them feel." The lesson of Eddie's life, and Lucas's, rippled through Englewood. The community center grew, funded by donations from locals, inspired by Lucas's work. Marissa, now a respected nurse, spoke at schools about resilience, sharing stories of her son's courage. Lucas married a social worker named Elena, who ran Harper House's youth programs. They had a daughter, Clara, named for the woman Eddie had loved. Every year, on the anniversary of that night by the creek, Lucas took Clara to the spot where he'd found Eddie. "This is where I learned what family means," he told her when she was 6, her small hand in his. "A man was hurting, and I helped him, not because I had to, but because it was right. He helped us back, and that's how we build a better world." Clara listened, her eyes wide, and Lucas knew she'd carry the lesson forward. The educational message was clear: true wealth isn't in bank accounts or skyscrapers, but in the love and kindness we give and receive. Eddie's gift to Lucas wasn't just money. It was the belief that one act of compassion could change lives. Lucas lived that truth, turning a forgotten creek into a symbol of hope, a place where a community learned to lift each other up. In Baraboo, Eddie's legacy lived on in the kids he'd taught, who never knew his real name but remembered his patience. In Chicago, it lived in Harper House, in the kids who studied there, in the families who found a second chance. And in Lucas's heart, it lived every day, a reminder that family isn't just blood. It's the people we choose to love, to save, to carry forward. As Lucas stood by the creek one evening, now lined with wildflowers, he felt Eddie's presence. "You taught me everything," he whispered. "I hope I made you proud." The water flowed on, carrying the story of a boy, a man, and a bond that proved kindness is the truest legacy of all.